am the digital engagement editor here at the Chattanooga Times-Free Press. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are going to be talking to Sam Hall, who started ChattanoogaHistory.com, and Mark Kennedy, a Times-Free Press columnist here and the writer behind the Remember When Chattanooga series. I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to them to get this started. But please, if you have any questions, if you're watching on Zoom, please just post them in the Q&A part of Zoom, and we will try and get to them. And if you're watching on our Facebook live stream, go ahead and post them in the comment section, and I'll be looking there too. So I will go ahead and kick it off to you, Mark. Thanks.
Thanks, Allison, and welcome everybody. I am Mark Kennedy of the Chattanooga Times-Free Press, and I'm here today to repeat with Sam Hall, who is the curator of ChattanoogaHistory.com. Sam, I like saying that word curator. It sounds fancy. How are you today?
Well, it does sound fancy. I'm doing great, Mark.
It's good to see you. I just want to say on a personal note how much I've enjoyed working with you the last few months on our Remember When Chattanooga project, which some people may have seen in the Times-Free Press print edition, but also on our website. It's been a joy to work with you, to see some of these old images of our city and to learn more about it. Just this morning, I was working on a piece for this week, which is about Kay's Castle ice cream store that used to be on Brainerd Road, a place I had passed literally thousands of times in my 40 years here in Chattanooga, but didn't know the history of. It's little things like that I'm picking up by doing this project that's really been educational for me. And I know this is something that's always been a passion of yours. I interviewed you once for a column, and you were telling me about how you got hooked on photography when you were sort of a young man. Can you tell our viewers that story?
Absolutely. Yeah, when I was in high school, I got my first real camera, and in fact, I have it right here. It was a 35 millimeter film camera. Still have it. I don't think it works, but now, but it served me well back then. And I did something kind of unusual and bold now that I think about it. I took it to school with me. I took it to high school, Red Bank High School, back when it was over on Dayton Boulevard. And I took pictures, not of just individuals, but I took a picture of people in the cafeteria having lunch, kids in hallways changing classes. And what I found, even though those are boring photos back then and people might look at me funny, fast forward almost 40 years later, it seems like I was a genius. I'll share these with my classmates on Facebook or wherever, and they're like, wow, I wish I had done that. And what occurred to me is the photos that are boring tend to have a lot more lasting power, and they're more interesting as time goes on. That is true of today. Our selfies, unfortunately, I hate to break it to everybody, but they're not going to be that interesting 100 years from now. But you take a picture of something commonplace, where you work, a street scene, whatever, that's going to be a lot more interesting. So that's what came out of that experience that I can apply today.
Okay, can you hear me? You broke up a little bit there.
Got real
okay, thanks. All right, well, let's fast forward the time machine just a little bit and talk about ChattanoogaHistory.com and how you got started doing that. Give me the origin story of your website.
Sure. Well, it really started back about 4 years before I actually launched the website. I've always been into historical photography. I've been into genealogy before, but I always come back to the whole history aspect of it. And I was always drawn to the photos. If I was in someone's office and they had an old picture of a street scene, I would get up and go look at it and ask about it, and even collect them. But I started finding myself looking for better versions of those photos. Because, you might see them in a book or newspaper and they look nice, but you can tell there's probably something better. Well, in 2011, I found that the Library of Congress had published some really high resolution scans of glass plate negatives, which were used in photography up until about the 1920s. And that's how images were stored on glass. What we're looking at now is actually about 3 or 4, I think it's 4 different 8x10 glass plates at the Library of Congress. They're available today. This is from Cameron Hill, looking at Chattanooga in about 1909. And I was blown away. So I went online and I downloaded them at the highest resolution because they make them available, and it absolutely choked my computer. And I was like, this is frustrating. I really want to be able to look at all the details. So I started looking for a solution. And there's a piece of software out there called Deep Zoom. That's, and the first website I put up in 2014, it was called Deep Zoom Chattanooga, until I got the better domain. But that's why, because the Deep Zoom takes these giant photos and it allows us to view them in the highest resolution possible without it choking a computer. It's compatible with our iPhones and iPads and mobile devices. And so that was the solution. So I started collecting as many as I could, turning them into this technology, and putting them online. Like I said, I created a brief, just a demonstration version of this scene that I would share with friends and family back in 2011, and said, hey, isn't this cool? And they say, yeah, it's really cool. And it occurred to me, I said, I keep finding new photos. I think I'll create a collection online. And that's how it started. And it just grew from there. It's a hobby that just kept growing.
One of the interesting things about your website is the interactivity. Like this vista we're looking at right now, you can actually do a zoom and cut this, 90-degree angle down to 30 and down to 10. That's what we're seeing there on the slide is a cross section of things. And we're actually focusing in, residents will notice this is the Dome building, which I mentioned yesterday was originally the Chattanooga Times building back 100 years ago, built by Adolph Fox. So from that wide vista that we started with, we have almost used a telescope to look down at a granular level at this building. And that's a feature of your website that can be replicated on lots of photos, right? That's what makes it so special.
That's the Deep Zoom technology. And just a little geeky side note, you're not looking at one solid image. You're looking at thousands of little images that are presented in a very smooth, dynamic way. We showed them here in just incremental ways so that people could see. But if you'll go to the website, all the Deep Zoom images are fully interactive and you can zoom in and zoom out. Some of them have more details than others, but it's amazing to me that this much detail was available in the early 1900s and even before 1900. I don't think growing up, or really until I discovered these images, that photography was that advanced back then. It's just that we've only retained low resolution copies unless we've scanned the originals.
Right. Tell us, or tell everyone why you think it's so important from a historic preservation perspective to have these images scanned in a digital way so they can't be corrupted. They can't dissolve in somebody's basement or attic.
Right.
Once you've got them preserved here, they're there forever, right?
Well, they're certainly more accessible, and that's really what my goal has always been, is to share those images with others, obviously, or it wouldn't be on the website. When the website first started, I was collaborating with the Chattanooga History Museum. Unfortunately, they did not last much longer than after I started the website. So that kind of drove me to expand what I was doing, because all of a sudden what was going to be a lot of publicly available information and images was not going to happen, or is much harder to get to. Fortunately, by the way, all that's at UTC Library and it's safe, but until we have a museum setting, it's not going to be available. So I enthusiastically present these photos, but I also learn a lot. You mentioned earlier about what you learned about Kay's Castle, and I have learned about every image that I put up there. I probably spend more time than I should digging up information on the past, but I enjoy it. I enjoy finding out who's in this photo, where is this photo. I discover things every day that I didn't know about a photo, that I just start looking at it and notice something I hadn't noticed before. But to further answer your question, if we don't save the original images, a lot of the information is lost. For instance, we just looked at how much detail when you can zoom in on it. If we just save a printed image, we may not see that address written over a door, a name written on a name tag, all kinds of pieces of information that let us connect the dots. Also, negatives, film negatives don't last as long as glass plates. Glass plates, if they're stored improperly, don't last either. So there is some urgency to gather these things while we can get them digitized.
There's sort of
And
a treasure hunt aspect to what you do. I know that you've got open arms hoping that people will donate things to this repository. We've talked before about how a lot of people think of old photographs being a shoebox full of family photos in the attic, and it very much may be that. But there are other mediums that you're especially keen to get because of the ability to fine tune the detail, like you explained before. Can you talk about some of the ways that people could donate images to this repository and have them last for thousands of years, maybe?
oh, I can't guarantee thousands, but that's I like your attitude. That's good. What we're looking at now is the three things you may see in a closet or in your grandparents' things that you didn't really know what they were. And some of you grew up with a lot of these things, probably the first two at least, and so it's obvious. But for the younger people viewing, I want you to make sure you know what you're looking at. The shoebox full of photos is always great, but it was printed from a negative, and we have 35 millimeter film on there on the left side, then 35 millimeter slides, and those you could create a little slideshow with and project them on the wall, and they look great. They have great detail. And then on the far right is glass plate negatives, and in their box that you would probably find them in. And many of the photos that have the most details on the website came from glass plate negatives. They are amazing to work with, but they are becoming more and more rare to find because it's not obvious to folks what they're looking at. They're heavy, they're made of glass, and so it's something that I'm looking for. I would love to find more of those. I know they're out there, but I'm okay with just film too, because that's what needs to be saved more than anything.
Sam, I know one of the things that you've done with your website, which I think is fascinating, is you've created some, for lack of a better term, then and now images, where you have taken old photographs, overlaid what's happening now so you can see a sense of what things used to look like and so forth. Can you talk about doing that? First of all, these images we have up here, let's move to that.
Yeah, I'll just quickly explain what we're looking at here.
Sure.
This is a glass plate negative that I'm just holding up in front of a close by scene. That is, that we talked about the dome building a minute ago. And people sometimes ask, well, how do you develop a glass plate negative? Well, technically they're already developed. This is what would be in those boxes I showed a second ago. But to see what's in the image, you invert the image. And so when we invert the image, we're going to see exactly what that picture looks like. And suddenly the background becomes kind of weird. And now we see that it's a young lady standing on the roof of the Loveman's department store, probably about 1899, I guessed, best I know. There's the fairly new dome building in the background. And I suspect the lighting was really good up there. And so the person that took these, we have a pretty good idea who that was. They worked there, and they probably took the lunch breaks and say, hey, can I take some pictures? I'll make you copies. That's my guess. I don't know that for a fact. Somebody has suggested that this lady is probably a seamstress. Around her neck is something that looks like maybe something they'd measure fabric with.
Yeah.
So there's
one of the things you notice with 19th century photographs is people dress to do everything. I mean, obviously this is a posed picture, but in photographs of that era, every photo that's made just about, people are dressed up. Just, they didn't have a lot of casual clothes. If they were outside the house, they had their good stuff on, right?
I think they were very uncomfortable. Most of the time. But yeah, you're right. It's and they were because they worked at a department store, they had access to the newest and latest fashions. I doubt that was her dress, but it was a great thing to model.
Yeah, it makes me think too. Maybe they were proud of that building in the background. It was probably a newer building downtown. It might have been like posing in front of the aquarium now to pose.
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay,
well, we're then and now, yeah.
Then and now, yeah. Show us some of that and tell us what you've discovered about.
Okay.
Now.
But there's plenty of places that you can see old photos. I mean, there's certainly Facebook groups aplenty. There are books. what I found after a while is I wanted to do more than just show photos. And some of them that otherwise would be boring, we can do something with. For instance, this weird looking photo is an aerial photo in the late 1940s taken by a photographer by the name of Roy Thule. And some of his negatives were saved by his daughter. So here's a great example of someone saving history. But I took a look at this and I really wasn't going to do anything with it because there are plenty of images like this. Then I realized, wow, there sure are a lot of buildings that are no longer with us. And so I methodically started creating a layer that can be toggled on and off on my website, showing in red what is no longer there, and what is not in red, the buildings that are still there. Hopefully nothing's been torn down since I did this a few years ago, and I'm looking to see. But
let's talk about some of the places that we see are still there. I see the Reed House, for instance. Name some of the other places that jump out to you as still being
Volunteer
around.
Bank Building, is that what it's called? Maybe there's the Federal Post Office, and
see the dome building there.
Yeah. And it looks like the edge of, or no, that's actually I call it the Southern Express Building there at 11th and Market on the far right. We also have the Patton Hotel. Well, Patton's not in this photo actually, but we have the Chattanooga Bank Building, that tall one there in the very middle. It's abandoned well, it's not abandoned, but it is vacant right now. We have the James Building, which was the first high-rise in Chattanooga. The McClellan Building is next to that. All these are pretty iconic buildings, and thank goodness they're still with us.
Well, down in the foreground here, I see some railroad buildings. You were telling me once that a lot of downtown, the way it's configured, if you look at it from a drone's eye view these days, is actually shaped by the railroads and where they existed at different times. You also told me once, I think, that there were fingers of Georgia, if that's the right metaphor. There were little properties owned by some of the railroad companies that came up into the city that were actually part of Georgia. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and there's a page on my website that I published just within the last month. I think I titled it Georgia State Line, and right there in front of the Reed House, you can see the shed, the train station that's there. That used to be Georgia. In fact, at this point where the photo was taken, it's probably technically Georgia leased land to the railroads. And Broad Street did not continue past this point until 1925. It's a wonderful story. It's too long to tell now, but you can check out the website and learn about it. But back to the thing about the railroad, how those railroad tracks have shaped the city. If we'll go to the next slide, which is also kind of a then and now example. This is an insurance map. Fortunately, again, thank you, Library of Congress and the National Archives, have saved things like these and scanned them in at high resolution. They're not photos, but they show very detailed images of buildings in many cities. It was used by insurance adjusters, of people that were looking to determine risk when they issued insurance policies. They needed to know what buildings were made of, how many stories, if they had any kind of fire suppression. So we get to use them now to compare then and now. You'll see those railroad tracks that are just all over the place. And you see street names that don't exist now, like Montgomery Avenue and Sydney. On the website.
What year was this? Do you know what year this map was, or what period of time?
Well, let's see. It's actually, your little video box is covering up the other side, so I can't tell, but people may be able to see it. It should be, I have one from 1928. There are multiple years available. Okay. This was probably around 1900, I believe, or 1901, because I'm looking at the names of these streets that are no longer there. Fort Street's still there. Williams is still there. But on my website, you'll notice there on the bottom, there's a 2018 view and there's a little slider bar. So if you slide that on the website, it's going to slowly transition to what is there now. And let's take a look at what that looks like on the next slide. There you go. Okay. Now flip back to the other one real quick, and then we're going to go back to it. I just want everybody to notice where the railroad tracks are on the previous one. Making her jump. So You'll see these triangular areas of land. That's where the railroad tracks were. Now there's parking lots. There's actually, I think, one set of tracks still there. We are looking down on, at the very top, that is the Chattanooga Hotel, the entrance to their facilities. And then in the very middle, you'll see where we have some green space built up in these little dots of green. That's where we've turned these railroad tracks into a green space. But you'll notice that along Warehouse Row and other places, notice how the road curves. It's because that's where the tracks were. And it's really neat to use a then and now look. This is one small section of a much larger view on the website, by the way. So when you go to the website, you can really roll around. Things are changing so fast downtown, though, that I'm going to have to update it because the 2018 view has changed significantly in some areas.
Sam, can you, for one last time, explain the mechanics of the little slider bar at the bottom? Is that a zoom in, zoom out feature if people went to the website?
It's a transition. It's a little transition between one and the other layer. Imagine that we put a one photo on top of another, or transparency rather, and then we fade out one. So right now we have the 2018 view, and then on the other one, we're looking at the map that was matched up to it as best as I could. And it's not a perfect job, but it's good enough for entertainment purposes.
And it looks like that map was actually from 1889, based on the little number in the corner.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. I just, my mind went blank on that because I've got several versions of it. I have a 1901 view, a 1928 view of many areas. But this one specifically is probably a good time for Chattanooga and its growth. There were a lot of development in downtown that wasn't before. Streets hadn't been renamed yet. So it's a good then and now comparison. If you learn, I've had people say, hey, I have some ancestors that lived on Elizabeth Avenue or something like that. Then they can go back and look where that was.
Sam, one of the interesting things I know about looking at photographs is sometimes you can make inferences from things like horizons about where something is. I know this slide we're looking at now, someone had a point of view about what this was that you were able to do some sort of sleuthing and disprove. Can you talk about that and tell us where you think this actually is?
Sure. This was something that was donated to the Chattanooga History Center several years ago. And written on the back was construction of Broad Street. They didn't think that's what it was. It just doesn't look like Broad Street in any way, shape, or form. And I said, I think you're right. And so they asked myself and some others to just, hey, if you know what this is, let me know. It looked very familiar to me. And I realized later why, because I grew up on Signal Mountain. And this view just looked really familiar and it was bugging me. I thought, where have I seen this? And I realized that is the Cumberland Plateau. That's Walden's Ridge, rather. And I looked to see if I could match it up on like Google Maps or just driving around. And then I realized this is not the building of Broad Street. This is the building of Signal Mountain Road. And so if we look at what is there now, everybody will see, oh, it's Komatsu and the Crystal. And you'll see that those mountains, as you were mentioning, match up perfectly to what was in the past. It's probably pretty close.
Yeah. That area right there would be directly in front of the Walmart if people travel through, right? So yes, the line of the mountains matches exactly. So that's a curious way you came to that conclusion, but perfectly correct, it looks like.
Well, I'm pretty tenacious when it comes to digging through clues. Everybody's good at different things, right? Some people like you are very good at writing articles. I'm not that guy. I depend on you to do that. But I'm really good at figuring out clues in photos and what they are. If there's a way to figure it out, I'm going to figure it out.
Yeah, that's a good segue because I think that's an interesting part of what you do. A lot of the photographs that come into your possession, they're not like photographs in a newspaper that has a caption that tells you who's in the picture and where it was and when it was taken. They're not like documentary photos that went along with a news story that would have that. In many cases, they don't have much information written on the back if it's a print. So a lot of times, having the image in hand is just the beginning of really finding out what it's about. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And that sometimes I've just had access briefly to the image. Like I don't own this image. It's it was scanned by the History Center, so I had a high resolution scan to work with. But from that, it allowed me to determine what I needed to figure out where it was.
One of the things we've had fun with the Remember When feature in the newspaper is a couple of times we've put photos in that we don't have identifications on. They might be a group shot of a few people. In one case, it was some ladies on a float around 1960. We've put those in the paper, and both times it's taken a few days, but somebody has seen those pictures that was either in it or knew who the people were and have reached out and gotten in touch with us. We have one picture that was about, I don't know, maybe 8 high school age people sitting in front of what looked like a concession stand with Coca-Cola on it. I had no information about that whatsoever. And I got a call from a lady in the late 80s who said, I'm one of the people, here's the IDs left to right, and this was an ad in our annual ad. I think it was Central High School in 1940 something.
It's amazing that happened, yes.
Sometimes we can put 2 and 2 together that way and use people's eyes as they see things in mass media. But you're working on something that I just find fascinating, and that is comparing old photos of the same period that were taken in Chattanooga, using one set where you have some IDs and trying to create facial recognition software so you can identify people in other photographs. Would you take a few minutes and just talk to us about what you're doing in that regard, Sam?
Absolutely. This is kind of a sneak peek into something I'm going to be presenting not too distant future about the class of 1889 from Chattanooga High School. Within the set of glass plates, there are some group photos. And there's just one of those that I've chalked up to, well, it'd be neat to know who these people are. And here's a great example of something that it takes a long time for some things to come out. But in Allison, if you'll bring up the image of the group photo out of the newspaper, that's a good start. So what would happen back then? There weren't many paper or photos in the newspaper of local people. But one thing they did almost consistently is they would have the graduating class photo in the newspaper, and this was the 1899 photo. So luckily they have numbered, somebody's gone in there and numbered them, and they have who those people were below. You wouldn't think those are good enough images to do facial recognition from, but I had a hunch it might be. So I use a number of different existing facial recognition software pieces, some that are just purchased local on the computer, some that are cloud-based. But now I have these names and I can assign them to faces. And I wondered if some of these people in this other images on the website could be those same people. I didn't know what year it was taken exactly. So I was trying to gather as many as possible. So let's look at the next one as an example. Here is an associated photo. This came from the library. It was donated, and this was, they created these every year. It was an elaborate process of showing all the different teachers in this case. And again, I've taken each one of these these people, assigned the names that I'm seeing here to those. I'm creating a database. The one up there at the top, by the way, second from the right, Professor Wyatt, he's the father of Chattanooga education and high school. He really founded public education in this city. Another person that we've kind of forgotten. Some people would say, oh yeah, I remember him, but most people don't know that. So again, I'm learning things as I go. So let's look at the next one. And here is the payoff.
That's amazing.
It really is. And I like it. I'm glad you like it. I think a lot of people will enjoy it. These are almost all the people named in this photo that just a few months ago, we didn't know who any of these people were. Now I've matched up with double and triple checking through other pieces of software on a face-by-face basis who these people are. The wife of Spencer Macaulay is in this photo, who one of the brothers that started Macaulay School. So people will get to see a photo that, to my knowledge, there's not a publicly available photo of her when she was graduating high school. Now, I assume that this photo was not a professional photographer. You notice how people are looking different directions. I think he lived nearby. He was a photo enthusiast. He did a pretty good job, but he looked for opportunities. And I think they were having a group photo taken. And he probably did what we do today. It's like, hey, do you mind if I jump in here and take a photo? I think that's what was going on. We'll never know, but the takeaway is this opens up a whole new level of identification. I'm building a database of faces. And then on the next slide, you'll see another example of using online software. It's looking at one cropped photo. And folks, this is from over 120 years ago. That's a pretty good photo for them. And then the best resolution image I could find, that it's looking at all the faces, and it says, I'm 90% sure this person is this person. And then if I could confirm that with other software, I would put a check mark. I'd say, okay, this is that person. And then
So
there's
it
one other.
a probability score? It gives you
Yes.
a probability score that this is a 90% chance that it's that
Yes.
person? Wow.
I think it says 90. Is it 90 or 99? Anyway, it might be 99. That's pretty sure.
Yeah.
Who am I to argue with a cloud computer? I don't know.
You
The
know,
next one.
Just thinking through this, I'm sorry, you keep going. You keep going.
No,
I'll
I was
insert.
just going to say, this is just to finish up this. Here's another piece of software that's comparing a face to the newspaper image. Now, this one, I think everybody could agree, yeah, I can see where that's the same guy. His hair is doing the same thing. It you know. And the other thing I noticed is people look the same in photos. Like, I don't take good photos. And I have to really make myself smile a certain way or something. Everybody consistently poses the same way, and that was a clue. That's all I was going to say about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What I was going to say, and we haven't discussed this before, but you talked about it, in this period, there weren't many photographs of people in newspapers. As you move through the 20th century, there's going to be a rich vein of that in the middle and later part of the century. The Chattanooga Free Press here was famous for its documentary journalism of groups. On any given day, there would be dozens of pictures of groups, of civic clubs, Boy Scout groups.
Mm-hmm.
All I'm saying is I think there's going to be a rich vein of facial recognition in that mid-century period just because of the tradition of one of the newspapers here.
I agree. And we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg as far as the ability to use computing power and search across multiple faces.
Yeah.
And
Hey,
I have a few questions here that I actually.
Okay, let's jump in there.
Logan asked, if someone finds old film or even glass plate negatives in their attic, how would they go about digitizing them?
Okay.
That's the first part of his question. So we'll address that first, then I'll ask the second part.
Okay. First, I hope they're not in the attic, because attics are no good for film. Photos survive okay for a while, but if you do know you have that in your attic, please get it out. If the film has survived, it has to be scanned with a transparency scanner. Those aren't as common as a scanner you would just scan documents with. I have what I'll call an affordable scanner, but it's $1,000 scanner that I invested in after doing this a few years because it does a very good job. You can get some used for a lot less, but if they're the kind of images that I'm looking for, then I would be interested in doing that at no charge. But if you have a lot that there's family and things that really aren't of mass appeal, definitely find a transparency scanner or seek out a service that would scan them for you.
Okay, and so the second part of his question is for current photographs that we take today, whether it be like on your phone or an actual camera, what can people do to ensure they are properly stored for generations to come?
Great question, because we live in the digital dark age. What I mean by that is that most of the photos that are taken today will be lost. I can say that with great confidence. When you think about it, if I said, hey, can you go get an image you took in 2006 with your digital camera or your phone, rather, what happens to our phones? We trade them in and we forget to download or back them up. We upload them to Facebook, which compresses them to smaller sizes. So my advice is always do a backup of your original digital photos from all your devices. And I know you have thousands and thousands, but do your best to have a backup that you're maintaining. 2 backups is even better. And the real thing to do to save them for long term is print out the best ones. It's not something we're used to doing nowadays because we pick up our phone and go, oh, look how great this is. In the old days, we had to print them, but that is the way to preserve them, because guess what? You're going to have a shoebox full of photos that your grandchildren will find. If you don't do that, I'm afraid those digital files are not going to be readable, or people won't know what this USB drive is that we use today, because it's going to be a few years down the road and we're going to use something different.
So, and Sam, you mentioned this. Okay, so is a shoebox an okay place to store them, or how should we store print photos, now in order
I'm thrilled for them to be in anywhere that's environmentally controlled, indoors. Is a shoebox the best way? Maybe not, but I will take that over other things. You definitely don't want to store them in a hot, humid environment. If you really want to do it the right way, there's photo sleeves that you can buy and put printed photos in there. Photo albums that have non-acid pages. I mean, there's so many levels you can take it to. And I'm not going to be an archive snob and say, well, you have to do it this way. Otherwise, what are we going to do? We're going to keep putting it off and we're never going to store it. But just print out your best photos, label in some very safe pencil or something on the back who the people are, and you will have created something that's going to last over 100 years. Otherwise, it's probably going to be lost.
And so we also have a few people who have asked if you have photos of certain places. So like
Okay.
old photos specifically of the East Brainerd area, such as like Hamilton Place, Gun Barrel Road, around there. Have you come across any of those?
Well, keep in mind that Hamilton Place, Gun Barrel was wilderness and farms up until, 1950s and 60s, maybe as early as the 40s, but there wasn't much out there. I have looked for that and wish I could say I have that. The most I have, the earliest I have of that area would be out toward Eastgate and the creek, that area, in the 1950s and 60s, because that area was growing. So there was interest, there were aerial photos. There are some Brainerd photos on the website now. And you can, by the way, you can do a search of the website. If you'll scroll down on the main page, there is a place to type in a search, and because there are hundreds of photos and it's kind of hard to find them otherwise. But where else have people asked about photos?
Yeah, and the other one is the Ridge Cut construction. Now, she didn't give me a year. It's from Kay. So Kay, if you have like a specific time period, please put that in the chat. But she said
It'll be
she
the
grew
late 50s.
Yeah, she grew up about a block away and played on the construction equipment after hours.
Oh, how neat. That sounds like something I would have done. That would have been the late 50s, I believe. And there are a few, and I will try to bubble those toward the top to present. We know that it took place, it was one of the first sections that was built. Actually, not the first section. The interstate used to dead end at 23rd Street. And that's where you would get off the interstate. And they opened up sections at a time, apparently. It's before my day, but my parents certainly remember. And by the way, my mom's watching today. Hi, Mom. And she remembers. And anybody that lived here in that time remembers it was inconvenient. And then it was somewhat convenient, and it was very convenient. But Kay, I'll try to find those and get them on sooner than later.
I know in some of the folders you provided to us, there are some of those photos. Let's you and I just resolve that in the next couple of weeks, we'll dig one of those out and run it as a feature. How about that?
That's a great plan. I like your thinking.
Let's do that.
And then Marcia is asking if there are any pictures of the state courthouse or women's suffrage marches, since this year is the 100-year celebration of the 19th Amendment.
There probably are, and I would love to have access to those. Fortunately, I think some of those might be at the Tennessee Archives in Nashville. I can't say for sure, but it seems like I've seen them. I know I have one from that time period of a large group of ladies that it could very well be they were involved with that too, just based on the time. But I would love to find that. I don't have any in my collection right now or know where some are, but they are probably, since that was such a historic thing, I would be surprised if there weren't.
And then we actually have one about sound. Do you deal with like sound ever, Sam? This from John. He says, I have a live voice message on a sounds, I think it's Scribber disc. The sound is not great. Is there any way to enhance and preserve these?
You know, it's kind of out of the scope of what I do, and I don't have the right equipment. I know that there are probably resources in town. When the library opens back up, I believe they have some audio equipment there, and they may be wanting to work with them to at least capture that at the highest sound resolution possible. And then that way, just with the photos, as technology gets better or somebody comes along that has good software to enhance it, they would. So from these discs, if he doesn't have a way to read that now, obviously you have to find someone that can do that. And even if it's something I don't do, feel free to contact me, and if I can point them in the right direction, I will.
Sam, maybe this is a good time for you to talk a little bit about how your collection is really crowdsourced, that most of the images you have been donated. And I don't think you'll mind me mentioning here that you're a hobbyist / volunteer, that you're not using these commercially, that you're doing this to preserve history, and you share them. So
That's right.
let's talk about the people who are listening today or may see this later, who have items that they would like to donate. By donate, it means having them digitized and returned.
Right.
You don't keep the images.
That's
right?
it's called digital donation.
Yeah, talk about how that works.
Okay, and I've done plenty of that. Sometimes people just want an image to find a home. For instance, the most recent image on the website was featured this past week in your column, and it was from 1992, Walnut Street Bridge. That was donated as the physical negative, as part of a few negatives from George Baker, and his daughter came across a box full of negatives. And that's a good example of, they could have been thrown out, but she realized that she didn't have the resources or time to go through them, but knew that somebody like me could sort through them, scan and share the ones that are worth sharing. That's a great example of just a donation. The Daughters of Roy Thule, several years ago, they were one of the first to come to me and say, hey, this is neat what you're doing. We would love for our father's legacy to live on with these images. And that's how, but I just scanned them and then returned them, had a couple different batches. And now everybody can enjoy them, but they still have the negatives. And that's very important to some folks. I will say it is important, if you have images, they're probably not worth a lot. If you're holding on to them, you're not sure what to do, just ask me about it, and I'll try to point you in the right direction. But if we can share those to the public, I think that's going to be the best thing you could possibly do.
Got it. So people can follow the series in the Times Free Press. The photographs generally run late in the week, sometimes Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. They don't have a particular regular day, but whenever they do run, they're also posted to our group on Facebook. So if you'd like to see them there, you can do that as well. And they're on our website as well. So there's 2 or 3 different ways you can sort of keep in the loop for these photos as we share them through time.
And before we go to, we do have one more question about if you have some photos of a certain place.
Okay.
Alan is asking, do you have photos of the old White Oak Elementary prior to it burning in the late 50s?
If I do, it's not identified as such. That may get into one of those categories of things have to be identified. I could put that on the be on the lookout for list. And anytime somebody has a question like that, the more information you can give me as far as where it was exactly would be very helpful. So Alan, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll keep it in mind. The other takeaway is, folks, I mean, a lot of people right now look at and really enjoy seeing photos on social media. It's the easiest way to get to them. But I want to make sure everybody knows, go to the website and you're going to see them in details you probably have never seen them before. I'm not going to post something that doesn't have a lot of details.
All right, excellent. And yeah, as Mark said before, we do have our Remember When Facebook group, which will typically post Mark's columns and Sam's pictures there first before we'll post them like on our main Facebook pages. So if you want to see this stuff sooner, definitely go and join that group as well. And thanks everyone for the good feedback. Julie says, thank you so much for your work and for sharing it today. Chattanooga history is rich and layered and deserves to be preserved. So
I agree.
All right, and we'll have a recording of this available after as well, and probably a short write-up from Mark if you all want to check back on our website in a day or two for a little debrief if you missed anything or you want to go and play back any part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye.